Okay, here we are. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be wrapping up chapter 9. This chapter was Let Your Motto Be Resistance, and we're covering the topic around the resistance movement to slavery. Okay, for those of you who are listening for the first time, um, if you want to hop over and see the slides, you're welcome to click the link in my bio. The link in my bio, the very one at the top, will take you to a Zoom link where you can jump in. Just make sure when you jump in, your mic is muted. Obviously, unless I'm asking a question or something like that, then you're welcome to chime in. Um, and then if you're watching, maybe you're watching this pre-recorded on YouTube or something like that, please feel free, like, subscribe, share. Do what you can, comment, just help me with activity. I know I don't have the greatest YouTube channel ever. I'm kind of working on steadily improving it. But again, I'm also juggling these other things too. But if you can support me, support me. Also, for those of you who are curious, if you want access to the readings on what is it? The readings on Patreon, right? I don't know why that took so long for me to say. But all of the chapter readings are available on Patreon. They're scanned. I upload them weekly, in addition to the slides, because I recognize that like my body is blocking like a quarter of the screen here. So just a friendly reminder, you can hop over to Patreon. And if by any chance you are willing to support me, you can kick me $3, $5, $10, whatever you want to, but all of those materials are available for free. Accessing this material is for free. Anyway, let's jump back into this. So, where we left off, we were talking about obviously the resistance movement, and we keep circling around this idea of like the Civil War. What's going to happen in the Civil War, and blah blah blah. When do we get to that? Well, I promise you, next week is where we will get to the events that directly trigger the Civil War. And that will be quite interesting. We've been covering the cultural context around that for a while. But nonetheless, this is still important. So, where we left off, we were talking about many different things. The politics of being free, the politics of being a white abolitionist, the politics of being a black abolitionist. What does that look like? In all of its complex forms, what do the relationship dynamics between free whites and free blacks look like as far as the abolitionist movement is concerned? So that's where we've been talking about that. Where we left off, we were talking about how black churches were essentially the places of community, not just for being a house of worship. But also being those places that these abolitionist speakers and activists are championing their ideas, they're centering their goals and aspirations. Even white anti-slavery groups are leveraging the structure, the houses, or the housing rather, that the abolitionist movement needs in order to sustain itself. But many of these abolitionists were doing other things too. And these are some interesting newspaper clippings. What I want you to pay attention to here, for those of you who have access to the slides, I think it would absolutely be interesting if you got on the slides and then you're able to kind of zoom in and read some of the newspaper clippings here. Maybe this big one might be a little harder to read, but these are some of the newspapers that existed during the time. And pay attention to the dates if you can see them. I'm not sure. I'm like sharing a PowerPoint screen through Zoom and then it's getting recorded. So I don't know what the picture quality looks like on your end. But they had like abolitionist newspapers like the North Star, like anti-slavery. And so they would basically use these newspapers to spread their ideas, to champion their ideas, to center their rhetoric, to make arguments, to make appeals and things like this. And even though newspapers were like less influential, newspapers were not they're not going to be as impactful as you would think. You have to remember that like the culture is centered around pro-slavery first and then anti-slavery as an undesirable second, right? So is it really going to be the case that like somebody who finds themselves carrying normative white supremacist ideals and pro-slavery attitudes is somehow just going to like pick up a newspaper and then go, well, I guess they made their case and that's going to convince me? Like, absolutely not. That's just not going to happen, right? Despite that, though, there is this ongoing effort to make whatever stand that the anti-slavery movement can to reach as many people as they can. So this is what political activism in antebellum America is going to look like. Okay. And the dates for this, you can see December 3rd, 1847. You've got January 12th, 1861. This is going on for decades. Okay. And it doesn't stop until necessarily the end of slavery, at which point it becomes a major political battle. Um, but like in order for these newspapers to get their ideas out there, you can't really charge people a fee because then even if it's 5 cents, 2 cents, whatever the cost is that you want to be able to sustain something like the newspaper, who the hell is going to buy it? Right? So these are just free newspaper clippings. They're passing them out. They're trying to spread the word. And I guess to some extent you might characterize the fact that they are printing these newspapers daily, the fact that they are passing out these newspapers, that they're going to printing presses and they're trying to their best to mass produce these things should to some extent characterize the level of investment that they have in the anti-slavery movement. So really, to some extent, it isn't just people who are just as a matter of convenience because you're white and you're free and you get to live in this America that I guess will be like contrarians and will try to take up a social justice cause or something like that. Like, no, at the end of the day, and I don't mean to mischaracterize these people. Please mute your mic. Um, uh, I don't mean to mischaracterize these people. They really are committed to to the anti-slavery cause. And so ultimately, that's like a double-edged sword. Is in one sense, it costs money to print these papers, right? It costs money to write these things. It costs money to get it out there, to have people go and deliver these papers to other places. And if you're not turning a profit, that means that ultimately these newspapers are like financially unsustainable, right? And so that's how it goes. Is these newspapers, they'll prop up with a new name, a new journal, a new editor, or whatever. And then after a little while, they kind of fizzle out, but then a new one props up and it keeps going on and on and on in a cycle. Okay. At the same time that you have these newspapers going on, let me get to the next slide here. You also have rhetorical appeals, right? And by rhetorical appeals, what I mean is you have people that are against the slavery movement that are going out into the public. Maybe they set up a table. Maybe they set up a tent, right? Maybe they stand somewhere where there's high traffic, and then they start calling people out, sharing their ideas, right? Okay. And so, does that sound familiar, right? Somebody goes up, they set a table, they set up a tent, and then they want to like debate people, right? Spread their ideas, get some attention, build the attention, get the crowd to get involved, start debating people right in front of the, yes, Caleb, Charlie Kirk. It's almost like nothing is new under the sun. Nothing is new. And on the rhetorical appeals in the 1800s, again, the period, not necessarily a specific period, just as long as the period is before the Civil War. Is it accidentally similar? Well, by accidentally similar, do you mean coincidence? Well, yes and no, right? Coincidence is that to some extent, it's people going out and they are championing the political values that they believe in. And I think that the same can be said for Charlie Kirk to some extent, right? Um, at the same time, though, right, coincidence implies that like there were just there were no conditions in common and the same thing happened. Well, the conditions are there's a political climate, there's a niche for political activism, and people want to find a way to make political influence, to influence our democracy, the laws that get passed, the ideals that are centered as normative and valuable. And so then what happens is this is one of the ways that they go about doing it is you can get lots of attention, you can get lots of people to come and kind of showcase, perhaps even reinforce your spectacle. Because one of the things that will give you credibility, and I use that with air quotations here, credibility is if other people can see you having a back and forth with somebody. And in your debate, maybe you are owning them. Maybe you are slapping them down with your ideals and demonstrating that they're like inherently flawed in some inarguable way or irrefutable way, right? And then some people might then be motivated to at least think about themselves and go, damn, you know what? He's right. Maybe I should blah blah blah. And then and let I don't want to characterize this as an absolute failure because to the same extent, maybe not the exact same extent, but to a similar extent that Charlie Kirk was successful here, you could certainly characterize that many of these abolitionists were also successful at changing people's minds and persuading them. Now, to what extent, to what magnitude, I can't possibly characterize that, but I think it should go without saying that to some extent, part of the reason why they're doing this is because it is a perhaps successful method, right? Okay, so where we had introduced the AASS, this is an anti-slavery organization that's run by William Lloyd Garrison, right? And his leadership there is contended. Um, they're basically trying to figure out whatever strategies they can that are possible in order to try to win over the American people, that you can win the fight against slavery by leaning into the politics of American democracy rather than trying to lean out of it and go, oh, well, we need to throw the country away and black people need to form their own country and blah blah blah, right? Okay. So part of the nature of the AASS, which again, I'm not going to compare them to Turning Point USA. I don't think they're even remotely comparable at all. However, they are a formal organization that is dedicated to the political cause of the abolitionist movement. And their appeal, a lot of their appeal to the anti-slavery sentiments to the public are by appealing to Christianity, right? If you can appeal to people's most fundamental and core religious and moral values and demonstrate that Christian values are in accordance with the anti-slavery movement, then perhaps that might be the most critical, dare I say, existential way in which you could change the hearts and minds of the American public. Okay. So in their Christian consciousness, part of the core of their argument is things like, there's a genuine concern. I have a concern for people being able to make it into the pearly gates of heaven, right? And part of the reason why you might end up burning for eternity in hell is because you are subjecting human beings to immeasurable and immoral cruelty and torture under the system of slavery. And then you have people that will then go, well, I don't own slaves. I'm white. I don't have a role to play. Why are you trying to guilt me? You're going to say I'm going to go to hell because I'm complicit in the system of slavery when I don't own slaves? And then these abolitionists would then be like, well, yes. Yes, you're still complicit in the institution of slavery. Well, how? Well, part of the argument is that the clothes you're wearing are made of cotton. And where are we getting that cotton from? And part of the wages that you get from these factories that are processing raw materials, where are they getting those raw materials from, if not slave labor? And so they're making this argument that, like, the American public, whether they're in the North, especially in the South, but even in the North, let's say, despite the fact that you're in the North and you may not personally own slaves, doesn't mean you're not benefiting from the institution of slavery in some way. They're also arguing other things too, right? Appealing to people's religious values. They're appealing to this idea of their employment being tied to it, but also that in essence, slavery is like it's an inefficient labor system. Isn't part of the reason why you have these measly wages that you're struggling to compete is because these people are paying you low wages on purpose. All they want to do is enrich themselves. And if they could, they would replace your labor with slave labor in a heartbeat, right? So they're making this argument that, like, they're trying to persuade the American public that, like, slavery is inefficient and ineffective on numerous fronts. In the Turning Point Charlie Kirk style fashion. And it's not as if it's just one person. I know to some extent this image right here would almost imply to you that, like, one person is out there. But the other aspect of it is, how you have like Brandon Tatum and all these other people who will sit under the Turning Point tent too, and then go out and debate and argue and try to convince and blah, blah, blah. It's like that. You have people that are just members of the group. And for the public, you have to keep in mind that mainly it's going to be white people who are doing this, right? A black person wouldn't dare have the audacity to stand on a set of stairs, right? Try to morally challenge white people and then like debate them and somehow think they're going to walk away without a beating or a bruising or something, let alone getting lynched. Like, so most of the time, you have white people that are doing this. Okay. And so, yes, at the very basis of their arguments, they're also criticizing white Southerners. How could they not? Because at the end of the day, the people in the South have heavily concentrated and leaned into the institution of enslavement. Right. Um, but another interesting argument that they're making is that, like, the US government is actually protecting slaveholder interests and sacrificing the interests of, like, just the working class white people. Don't you care about that? And to some extent, excuse me, to some extent, that argument is true. It's valid, right? Because here is the Constitution that's being drafted with several clauses that can be interpreted to be pro-slavery, right? Where Congress is passing laws in favor not only of like just the protection of the institution of slavery, but as well as its expansion, while not necessarily going to the same lengths to protect the interests of common white working class American citizens, right? So they're making this argument that, like, all the way up to the US government, they don't even have your interest, right? And to some extent, you could say, oh, they're sowing discord. They're like sowing division and animosity, making people question democracy. But again, given the cultural context, the historical context, the economic context, whatever context, I could repeat that word over and over, that you want to consider, to some extent, these arguments are valid. It isn't necessarily like the Turning Point USA thing, where like he will stretch the truth, insert misinformation, make bold false claims, lie, like say things that are blatantly dishonest. They're not doing those kinds of things here. And to some extent, for the sake of like considering the 1800s, you also have to remember that in the 1800s, I would go so far as to say people may have been morally corrupt. And compromised to some extent, but when it comes to things like academics, enlightenment, the politics or debates therein, people tended to err on the side of like intellectual honesty, right? And especially for such a cause that you are willing to spend more money than you're making in an effort to support those values, you can only expect that these people then are going to be committed to intellectual honesty, right? Um, so then the last argument that they're making is like even if let's say somehow you wanted to source your clothes and all of your products and your labor from like something that is not slave oriented or slave produced or something like that, you're still supporting slavery by giving the US government your tax dollars, right? And your tax dollars then not only go into the pockets of your elected officials, but then that money then is also getting circulated into expanding the slave economy, thereby further compliciting you in it. And at the end of the day, after you die or after you face judgment and you're standing in front of the eyes of God, uh, God is going to look poorly on you because of your support for this inherently immoral institution. So, what do you think, like people are going to respond? How do you think people are just going to collectively respond if you have people that are out there going, you should feel guilty, you should be looking at yourself, you're complicit, you're blah blah blah. People are going to be angry. They're going to be upset. And in their anger and their upset, they're absolutely reacting with violence. Okay. So you have people that will, if pushed to it, will go up, run up to somebody, bip, and get into a fight, make a nosebleed, make a lip bleed, give them a black eye or something like that. I don't know of any circumstances in which a person was killed like Charlie Kirk, right, for trying to debate people the way that he was, right? But there were certainly people that were lashing out with violence. So that much is true, right? Okay. Then you have people that would show up. Maybe they would go and grab a stack of newspapers and just burn the newspapers. So the newspapers, which were printed and then distributed with no expected cost or anything, just get burned. You have journal writings that get mass printed, pamphlets that are getting mass printed, these chick tracts that we were talking about, these kinds of things that would get distributed, and people would do their best to actively resist the spread of like the abolitionist rhetoric and agenda. Okay, in certain cases, they go to the to where these newspapers are being mass printed, and then they're burning down the newspaper building too. Similar to the whole Charlie Hebdo kind of thing. Usario says, unfortunately, slavery continues to exist in different levels in Brazil, which is known as a multiracial country. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's um, exploitative labor systems, which may or may not overlap slavery, exist in some spectrum, and so to some extent can be characterized as a form of slavery. Absolutely. Um, and then you have some states that are like they're tired of like people mailing out these chick tracts and then they get these like garbage mail with like these anti-slavery ideas. It's getting passed out so frequently that it's almost like do you remember, if anyone here is old enough to remember the days of like AOL when you had like you would jump on the internet and you would get all of these pop-up ads and they'd be so annoying. Like it would be like a thing where as you're trying to explore the internet, you're like actively clicking out all of these pop-up ads and things like that. Well, that's like the anti-slavery movement during this period is becoming to some extent, and for lack of a better term, asinine. They're like doing it on purpose. They're being annoying on purpose. They're pestering people on purpose. And so, to some extent, some people are making this argument that, like, they're so annoying that they're actually undermining the merit of their own cause. Is people are so annoyed with the anti slavery people that they're not even annoyed by the ideas. Maybe they agree with the ideas to some extent, but because they're constantly pumping this information out, they're shoving it down people's throats at all waking moments of the day. Now they're getting in the mail. Now they're trying to change our values and blah blah blah. It's just becoming a thing where like, can we like censor the mail? Like if they're trying to send these out in the mail, can you just shove them in the garbage and not even have them show up in our mailbox? Elena says, wait, it's like the reaction to liberalism. Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Is people like you have people that I don't want to say everybody, right? Because everybody is not monolithic when I say this. But you do have people, like I said, that are like, maybe I agree at the end of the day with some of these arguments, but like they're so fucking annoying that like I can't even find a way to justify supporting them. Okay. So this is what the anti-slavery movement is kind of warping into. And by 1836, you have congressional representatives that pass what's called the gag rule. And the gag rule comes about specifically because uh, so many petitions regarding the issue of slavery are being brought to vote in House and in Senate by some of these elected officials, rare, but elected officials that are championing their constituencies' interests, that they are then being pressured to bring forth legislation so that we can definitively vote on the issue of slavery or how to regulate slavery or how to stop its expansion or how to abolish it or how to anywhere in between that. That now Congress is passing a rule that like any motion to address anything about slavery needs to just stop. Okay, like just completely stop this issue. Okay, this is how annoying it gets. This is a very old, right above me, a very old political cartoon that kind of characterizes the nature of the anti-slavery movement during this period is it's almost comedic in a weird way, is you have these like annoying abolitionists that are motivated by some of these free black people, and like they'll just pop up out of nowhere, like almost like a Muppet character of some kind, right? Just pop up from behind the box and go, you should feel guilty. Slavery is wrong. Slavery is immoral. You're going to go to hell. What are you doing? Where are your taxpayer dollars going? And blah, 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 and on and on. And so this guy right here is being driven into misery by the fact that he is being pestered with anti-slavery sentiments and ideals, right? Um, and so, like I said, although you might say to some extent that that is a fairly pessimistic way to look at the anti-slavery movement, to some extent it is the truth. Okay. Um, and so then with the gag rule, I know that the AASS had sent out 14, or excuse me, not 14, 415,000 petitions within a single year, just trying to get like the gag rule removed. Part of that was based on this idea that, American ideals mean the freedom of speech, that American democracy can't exist without people championing the ideals that they believe in, and that to some extent, in order to maintain consistency and merit on the American political cause, you can't censor people from pushing the buttons that were made to be pushed the way they're being pushed, right? And so by 1844, the gag rule does officially get repealed. But part of the reason why the gag rule even existed in the first place was almost along the same logical lines that you'll hear certain naive people articulate around the topic of racism. Is, oh, racism wouldn't really be that big of an issue if you could just stop talking about it. Like if you stop talking about it, it'll just go away. Right. And the reality is that's how they're treating this issue, is these abolitionists, like maybe the issue of slavery wouldn't be such a big deal if we just stop talking about it. Yeah, thank you, Jen. Like if we stop testing for COVID, then maybe the numbers will go down, right? That it's just not that's not how that works. Um, and yet and still, even after you get like the gag rule repealed, you still have people like angry mobs, angry crowds of people, angry pro-slavery white people that are going around attacking the abolitionists, burning down their newspapers, burning down black neighborhoods, any free black people, harassing them in the streets. It's not like anything really changes. It's just more like on the American cause, you really cannot censor people championing their own political values and ideals because you think they're annoying, right? Um, so to some extent, that's how you get that, right? Um, and then okay, maybe maybe you get to a point in time where the abolitionists are willing to acknowledge that they are being a little bit annoying. Okay. How could they be more substantive? How could they be more effective in their abolitionist struggle if not to pepper people with chick tracts and annoying info bits and to like go and debate them in the streets and anger them? So this is where part of the reason this happens is because if you recall what I said about the AASS being split, because women were elected to represent certain positions of leadership within the organization, you then have these offshoot organizations that prop up out of nowhere. Okay. And some of them, one of them, excuse me, was called the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, or AFAS for short, right? And AFAS is ultimately responsible for trying to transform the anti-slavery movement into a substantive one rather than an ideological one. So they were responsible for forming what would become the Liberty Party. It only existed for an 8-year period, but the Liberty Party, as the name implies, is centering the values of liberty. And the values of liberty here, meaning freedom, is that it is implicitly and by name an anti-slavery political party. Okay. Now, William Lloyd Garrison becomes integral to the existence of this party, championing their ideals and values and trying to get elected representation in Congress so that they can kind of like manifest their anti-slavery values in political form, that you can actually just be a part of American democracy and then start trying to pass or create your own legislation that would then systematically dismantle anti-slavery from the inside, right? Um, but by this point in time, I think, first of all, I don't know the man, never did, never even saw what was going on here. But my speculation and my limited information leads me to understand that William Lloyd Garrison was faced with so much pressure from both sides, the pro-slavery side and the anti-slavery side. Um, because he's being criticized about how he's a white man who's leading the anti-slavery movement. There's white people that hate him because he's a nigger lover. All kinds of political pressure that he becomes like too radical. Now, when I say too radical, I'm saying too radical in reference to how the history books would characterize him, but I don't necessarily use that language to say that you should feel like he's too radical. And the reason why I say that is because at this point in time, William Lloyd Garrison is very clearly able to see that the rhetorical arguments aren't working very well. The debating isn't working. You know, you're sending people who are members of your groups basically out in public in isolation to go anger a bunch of white people who then get pissed off and start fighting them. They're getting newspapers burned down, communities are getting attacked, people are still getting lynched. You still have the institution of slavery. So Garrison is recognizing that, like, it's not really realistic to some extent to try to transform the American cultural and political landscape into an anti-slavery one. Specifically, when your laws, your constitution, many of the people who are members or citizens of the country are all pro-slavery. So Garrison starts calling for the destruction of the Constitution and that like the North and the South need to secede. Okay. And that, like, America, in order to lean into the values that it truly says it has, should kind of cut out the South like a cancer. Now, he is not the first person necessarily to espouse these ideas that states should secede, that the Constitution should be destroyed, and things like that. And again, for his time, for the period, for the historical context, I'm not telling you you should think that he's too radical here, but you can certainly understand that if you are championing for humanitarian rights and freedoms that are not being protected, even by laws that call themselves just, to some extent, you could understand why he would pivot in this way. Okay, so he's becoming more and more radical as time goes on. Now, as far as the Liberty Party is concerned, they are attracting the support of Black people. Now, when I say attracting the support of Black people, I think in everywhere except, I want to say, Boston, Massachusetts. Somebody can fact check me on that. Black people cannot vote. Okay, so keep that in mind. So when I say Black support here, I'm talking about logistical and ideological support on the political front, like on the campaign front. Black people who are free, especially in the North, are doing their part to help champion the Liberty Party and to get some of their candidates elected into office. Excuse me one moment. I just have to cough really quick. um, Usario says or asks, is there a political intention through public policies to reduce the disparities between Black people and white people in the US? When you ask this question, do you mean like in today's time, or do you mean in history? In history, I think outside of the anti-slavery movement, this really didn't exist. In the modern era, I would say any such policies are usually characterized as racist currently. And so, although ideally we might find that these kinds of policies should have support. I think the American conservative footing is strong enough to disrupt these kinds of ideals. So no, I wouldn't say they exist right now, especially in the Trump era. Um, Getting back to the point here, though, they're passing out these like they're putting this on newspapers. They're passing out chick tracts. They're still trying to spread messages. But one of these newspaper clippings is actually seen right here, right? Why support the Liberty Party? Well, they give you five reasons. Number one, because the slave system can be effectually reached by political power, right? So that's the goal. Get elected, get a sizable majority in Congress. You can dismantle slavery that way. Number two, because no other party will undertake its overthrow. Okay. So they're acknowledging right there. You have Democrats that are explicitly white supremacist. Again, the Democrats here are not the same Democrats that we know of today. They are the ancestors of the conservative movement. Okay. And then you have Republicans who are kind of split. Some of them are against slavery, some of them only want its restriction. You're not really going to get a definitive political party that is like abolitionist, like these radical abolitionists here. Okay. Number three, because voting for pro slavery parties is fatal to anti slavery integrity and consequently to the anti slavery cause. I think that one is self explanatory. Number four, because the people will and ought to go to the ballot box, and the nature of our government has taught them to go in bodies or parties. Hence, it is certain, unless a new party is formed, they will generally go with the old and their sacrifice their anti-slavery character and the rights of the slave together. Doesn't that sound familiar? Sound familiar when you go, oh, people treat their political parties like they're a football team and they're just rooting for this team, even if sometimes the team is going against their own interest, but they're not trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So they throw out their values and vote with the old. See, nothing is new under the sun. Everything we're observing in American political discourse has already happened before. Okay. Then, number five, last but not least, because the existing prominent parties cannot be supported without moral wrong. I think you could also, for the most part, give that same criticism to the two-party system we have in American democracy today to some extent. But yes, Caleb, he says it sounds like the MAGAs. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, sure, right? I would say though that the MAGAs, the MAGA movement right now is like the grandchildren of this era's Democrats, right? So you can make the connection that way. But in essence, then you're going to attract Black people who are going to give their support in whatever ways they can, even if necessarily they can't show up to vote, right? So that's going to happen. And then in the ways that, like, maybe we're doing too much to appeal to ideas, to politics, and at the end of the day, we really just need to be committed to like the liberation of these people. Yeah, Stephen Bowman says the Democrat and Republican parties were very different back then. Absolutely, but that's why I say, right, the line of history is continuous, and today's MAGA, I would say, are the grandchildren of this era's Democrats, and I think that's fair to say, despite the fact that their political values are different, right? Um, so, in what ways could we manifest our anti-slavery abolitionist ideals outside of just the realm of ideas? And so, this is where you get people that are trying to put their anti-slavery values in motion by helping slaves to escape. Okay, and in helping them to escape, um, in lots of ways, you have different people that are helping to escape. And escape is going to look like different forms, right? I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember the film Amistad. It was very famous back in the 90s, right? Maybe it's been a little bit forgotten about now that it's 2026, right? But the film Amistad was about these 54 African men that were trapped aboard the ship named after or with the same name right? And these 54 Africans had essentially successfully revolted, right? They overthrew all of the ship personnel, killed many of them, if not all of them. I don't want to say all of them, but many of them. Um, and then basically tried to turn the ship around and go back to Africa. Okay. And so then a U.S. warship that happened to be sailing in the Atlantic Ocean essentially intercepted this ship and figured out what was going on, and then arrested all of these men and then put them in court. And then in court, essentially, the U.S. court would later rule that technically the people aboard the ship are free. And the reason why they're free is because even though they were taken from Africa, they hadn't yet set foot on American land, and so were not under legal jurisdiction of the United States to which they would have been enslaved. And so, acting on their own self interest of self preservation and defense, one can then say that these individuals are acting with their own interests in mind and so are therefore free. And so, in a rare circumstance, this is very rare for the time, and even surprising that a judge might rule in favor of slaves in this regard, especially during this time, you then have people who are then earning their freedom, right? Um, so outside of that, one could speculate, well, was the judge like an abolitionist or something? Who knows? I can't say. Let me take a sip of water. I can't say, but the idea is this is where you get people that are then putting their anti-slavery values in motion. Because if you're not going to get it through U.S. democracy, if you're not going to get it by appealing rhetorically to people, if you're not going to convert the masses into a pro-slavery cause by peppering them and inundating them with these really annoying ideas, then it looks like you're just going to have to do this yourself and do it the hard way. Okay, so this is where we get the formation of the Underground Railroad, especially by the 1860s. Um, and I don't want to say the 1860s. I would say by the 1860s, you have the Underground Railroad in its most mature form. Okay. But I would go so far as to say, like, the Underground Railroad actually existed for at least 30 years before 1860. So going all the way back to maybe 1833. And even then, the information on that is actually really shoddy. No one knows for certain how long it had really existed. Um, because how do you know that one of your slaves didn't get away through the Underground Railroad or may have gotten away on their own? How could you really distinguish? So it's kind of hard to say. But I could say with confidence that by 1860 it's in its most mature form. Stevens says the Texas portion of the Underground Railroad existed in Mexico. Yes, yes. Um, because you have to remember, like, geographically speaking, if you're in the deep South, and let's say you're in the deepest parts of Texas, it might actually be much more of a headache to try to travel through other parts of what we now call the Bible Belt today in order to get to what they then called Canada West. Okay. And if you could get to Canada West by this period, because the British had outlawed slavery, then technically you'd be free. And because you're in a different country, then you can't be returned to the United States. So you have many people who it's actually just logistically speaking easier for escaping Black people to flee into Mexico, where Mexico too, again, assuming we're in the 1860s period, but in general, Mexico had abolished slavery. Okay, so you're going to get Black people that then go down into Mexico undocumented, right? Or are going into Canada undocumented, right? Um, in order to get their freedom. Okay. And so that's what's happening. Now, the vast majority are being sent up north. And part of the reason why they're being sent up north is because the nature of the abolishment of slavery in Mexico, along with its race politics and colorism, is reasonably off putting to the people that are there. Whereas the British, while they're not necessarily pro-black, are anti-slavery and definitively anti-slavery because of the historical issues with regards to the colonies and the United States. Okay. So the vast majority of people who are a part of this network or get funneled into this network, rather, are being sent into what's called Canada West. Okay. Now, despite the fact that the details around this are a mystery, there still are some substantive details to be established here. There is some historical speculation that the people responsible for the construction of the Underground Railroad, again, not a literal railroad, but just a chain of passing people along a system, was mainly being driven by women. Okay. And the reason why it's mainly being driven by women, and the argument can be made, although I'm not trying to say thank you, white people, white women, is because women during this period in time are known to be traditionally the subordinate ones, right? According to gender norms and values. They're subordinate. They're not expected to have autonomy and power. People aren't looking to them or expecting them to try to usurp a man's power, right? And so, to some extent, because they're home all day, because women usually tend to be the ones that run the domestic responsibilities, then that means that women, to some extent, are overseeing the domicile. And in overseeing the domicile, are in control over who they can stow away, allow to hide in a cupboard here or there or something like that. So one could reasonably conclude, maybe conclusion is a strong word, but reasonably guess that women played a significant role, and to some extent, because they're white women, whereas black women, although yes, black women are making monumental contributions too. Please do not take my words as if I am somehow trying to give credit to white women and undermine the contributions that black women made. But you have to remember, in navigating the race politics here, it's far more likely that black women would be attracting a lots of attention to themselves that white women might necessarily not be. Now, having said that, both white and black people are collaboratively contributing to getting these people away to freedom, even if it means undermining the United States, undermining the Constitution, undermining the law, because in this case, if you can't reach substantive outcomes the slow way or the legal way, then you're just going to have to do it the way you see fit, right? Um, so you had multiple escape routes. I think in addition to this arrow that you see here in Mexico, it should also be of note that you have black people that are fleeing from Florida and then going to places like the Caribbean or Cuba, right? Or Puerto Rico in certain cases. So that's happening too, right? Um, and so some people, in order for them to be able to uh, get into the Underground Railroad because the circumstances around it were a mystery. Sometimes the only way that they could get in is if they paid for it, right? Because then in paying for it, it means then that not only are you serious, but the people who are risking their own safety in order to get you out, they have an incentive to do so. Now, not everybody who escaped through the Underground Railroad had paid for it necessarily, but in order to preserve the mystery, it's not like you're going to be recruiting slaves from the plantation in mass and then just letting them go for free. It's a protective way in which you can kind of keep the details about this secret. Okay. Um, Now, Canada West. I was using this phrase, Canada West here. You have to remember, this is the colonial era. It's the pre-Civil War era. What we're calling Canada West here is actually on the East Coast. It's kind of like how we describe the Midwest, and you know how the Midwest is really just majority East Coast kind of leaning. This is because you have to remember the history of colonization, the slow level of development from east to west. So Canada West here is just that region where, like, at the moment you cross the border, and you're legally on the other side, that's when you are technically free, and not even the slave catchers of the United States can technically cross into Canada to go and try to collect you, right? Now, having said that, even though Black people would flee to Canada West, in order to get their freedom, it doesn't necessarily mean that the white people who inhabited those lands wanted those black people there. There's a very complicated history around the white people kind of getting a regular influx of these undocumented, illegal immigrant black people who are showing up in Canada almost out of nowhere, and they're frankly kind of tired of it, right? And so you would get riots, you would get community burn downs, you would get all kinds of things. Like just because they abolished slavery doesn't necessarily mean that they were welcoming to black people, and we've kind of already established that, right? Um, but in general, because this is the British Empire, right, or part of the British Commonwealth now, what we call the Commonwealth anyway, you have essentially this is slavery is illegal here. So fugitive slave laws. Um, Especially as they were getting tighter and tighter toward the start of the Civil War. That's where you get people trying to get to Canada because the British are definitively against American slavery. Now, having said that, um, we kind of explored this a little bit, especially with talking about William Lloyd Garrison and the conflict he faced with the Black people who were a part of the anti-slavery movement. But you're also getting the rise of Black militancy prior to the Civil War, too. Lots of free Black people are even calling into question their white allies. Are their white allies really as committed as they say they are? Or are they just engaged in a kind of political theater? Now, to some extent, I don't want you to think of whiteness as monolithic because, as I just said, there are lots of white women and black women, but white people in general, that are a fundamental part of the Underground Railroad. Okay. And so, because the nature of their commitment is secret, okay, um, so in certain cases, it's so secret that you really do have to be selective about who you let in, even if they're on your side politically. Um, at the same time, that one might say that some of these hush hush white people really were secretly committed, even though they're being called out by the black people who don't know how committed they are. At the same time, there are some white people who really are in it for like political theater. They're not really committed to the anti-slavery cause as much as they would like to present that they are. And so then there are genuine questions from other black abolitionist activists that is to some extent valid, right? And so part of the reason why you're getting the rise of black militancy here is in part because of the inertia of the fallout of the AASS, right? You have black people that are tired of anti-slavery causes and movements or pro-black rights causes kind of being usurped by white people. And so in that regard, black people are becoming a little more militant. Okay. Then you have like these abolitionists that are trying to, including black activists that are trying to like just go to a plantation and organize a way to just get people off the plantation. Like, let's just go and let's be aggressive about it. To some extent, part of the rise of black militancy is coming from this criticism that white abolitionists really just like to go out and debate people. They're not really a like conservative. What am I saying? They're not really like abolitionists. They're not really down for the cause. They just kind of like going and showing face and winning arguments. And so they're kind of just committed on the debate front, but not really committed on the practical front. And like I said, to some extent, that is a valid criticism. You do have people who, for the sake of simplicity, the easiest thing they can do is say, I agree. And really, yeah, like Jen is saying, it's an intellectual exercise. But beyond that, when it really comes down to it, they don't want to be caught up in a circumstance where they might end up in jail or might end up punished or fined or imprisoned or something like that because they were caught breaking the law in ways that it was just inconvenient for them to some extent, right? So you have lots of black people that are like making the allegation that like a lot of these white abolitionists are just performers. They don't really care. Yes, to some extent they agree on moral grounds, but really when it comes down to it, like a lot of these people wouldn't really share space with black people, share their home, share a meal or something like that. And again, it's complicated. Don't think of whiteness as monolithic here. And to some extent, please keep in mind that there are white people who are receiving these criticisms. Meanwhile, they're on the hush hush about what they're actually doing. And that's not all white people. I can't say that's majority of white people, but it's just it's certainly a complicated dynamic in which, to some extent, the black people that are throwing these criticisms are absolutely valid for doing so. But then you don't know who's who, even though to some extent you kind of know who's who, and you kind of it's just complicated. It's a gray splat, if you will. I don't want to call it a gray area. I would call it like a gray splat, right? Now, part of the reason why black people are making the assertions that they are, again, it's not baseless, is I want to use Frederick Douglass as an example. He's not the only example here, but he is one of those examples, right? Is his relationship with the AASS and with William Lloyd Garrison is because Frederick Douglass was born enslaved. And he knew intimately what it was like to be enslaved, and he wasn't freed until he escaped on his own, excuse me, in his 20s. And from there, he had learned how to read. Okay. He developed a skill that would allow him to figure out how to get money. Okay. He escaped to New England. And by 1838, then he's becoming an anti slavery lecturer. And as a lecturer, he's using his personal experience, the ideas, his intellectual prowess, right? His critical thinking and academic skills to basically try to intellectualize the characteristics of the institution of slavery that would help people at all levels and in different ways of an anti-slavery organization to figure out how to undermine it. Okay. And so essentially he was kind of central and integral to the AASS. Okay. Um, but as part of being like an ex-fugitive slave and a lecturer for the AASS, not only is it that William Lloyd Garrison is not willing to give up his position of power as a leader, but then he's trying to limit Frederick Douglass to essentially just being or playing the role of an ex-fugitive slave. That like you can just say, hey, don't just take my word for it. Here's the word of an ex-fugitive slave. And now imagine introducing Frederick Douglass like that for like 15 years, 20 years. At some point, it just becomes a thing where it's like, does his identity have to be an ex-fugitive slave, or can he just be a human being and a person who's dedicated to the rights and freedoms of other human beings? You see how that works? So it just becomes a thing where like the criticism that like William Lloyd Garrison is getting, the criticism of the AASS, the criticism against white people of like this is like an intellectual exercise for you. You're just using these people as like toys and political pawns and etc. Part of that is true. Um, and so then it does call into question how serious they are, right? And so it's a very complicated circumstance. Two more slides here, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So, despite the fact that you have a spectrum of abolitionism across the American political landscape, Frederick Douglass himself, as an individual, he always firmly believed in this idea that, like, Black people who were here and enslaved in the United States belong enslaved. God, what am I saying? It's Sunday. They don't belong enslaved. He never said that. They belong in the United States as citizens, as people with equal rights, with equal freedoms. Okay. Um, and so during this period in time, the language that was used to describe his political position was like he's an integrationist. Okay. And so he's so fundamentally an integrationist that he believes that churches, for example, should not be racially segregated, that it's almost intellectually and spiritually dishonest um, for churches to be racially segregated while black churches are habitually preaching an anti-slavery message, and then the white churches aren't, but we worship and praise the same God. Right. Now, the reality is that I suppose one could say in retrospect that Frederick Douglass is naive to the idea that like churches are not political places of worship. Um, but that's his approach. That's his perspective. Stephen Bowman says, I love the story of how Frederick Douglass tricked white kids into teaching him to read. I was told he would bet kids they couldn't read something, a flyer or a book, then learning when they did. Do you think that story is true? I've never even heard of that. So thank you for introducing that to me for the first time. I feel like I may have heard something similar to the effect of Frederick Douglass learned how to read kind of on the fly. But I never heard details around it. So that's the first of me hearing that. I'll have to look into that. But thank you. Um, Okay. He's also proposing this idea that, like, the black people that are here are American, and that's true too, right? In the United States of America, we like to think of American as being this thing where, like, it's by default it's white and then everyone else has to like assimilate, and that to some extent we don't often think of enslaved people during this period in time as like being just as American as the white people who were here and always free. And yet, in order for you to be able to command a slave around, to communicate ideas, to be able to like have them exist in this world, they are in fact acculturated to US culture. So to some extent, yes, black people, the enslaved black people that are here are not just like some isolated void of like non-American citizenship. They actually are American and they're acculturated to American ideals and ways and modes of living, right? And so that's absolutely true. Michael B says the brightest people can pick up languages that way. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that I wouldn't say I tricked anyone into that's how I learned Japanese, but a part of becoming fluent was picking up on the things of the people around me. So yeah, that can be true. Um, and then of course you're gonna have black because blackness is not monolithic. Not every black person agrees with Frederick Douglass about this idea that you can integrate, because to some extent part of the criticism of Frederick Douglass was he's being naive, right? Who wants to integrate with people that want to kill you, right? And like these people, even if they're championing the ideas for your freedom, that don't mean that they want to live next door to you. That don't mean that they want to be friends with you. It just means that they feel like they're intellectually and morally superior, right? And in being intellectually and morally superior, they were still anti-black at the end of the day. So you have people like Martin Delany, for example, highly political black nationalist and activist. But again, black nationalists for this historical context. We're not talking about black nationalism as like the Hebrew Israelites or like the offshoot of whatever these, because I think the Hebrew Israelites, they're like jackasses. Okay. Um, we're not talking about that kind of nationalism. We're talking about the nationalism in the context of you have people who are enslaved. Essentially, if they get to freedom, they're like refugees. And even as refugees, they're not wanted. Okay. So maybe you have like a place where black people can go and they can have their own nation, their own land, their own freedom, and figure things out for themselves. It's that kind of nationalism in response to racial oppression, not perpetuating it. Right. So having said that, uh, you have you have people like Martin Delany that like really believe in these ideals that like Black people don't belong surrounded by white people as long as they're going to keep raping us and lynching us and enslaving us and doing these things. And he's suggesting that, like, not only do black people steal away to parts of Canada, obviously get free if you can, but because Canada doesn't want you, Mexico certainly doesn't want you. Maybe you got to go south of Mexico too, but like find something. Maybe we go back to Africa. Maybe we go into Latin America. Maybe you go into the American West where they haven't really developed too much yet, and you can kind of create a black nation state for yourself, where these black people can actually be free and just enjoy being human without racial persecution, right? So because you're getting all of the resurgence of violence, we were talking about the resurgence of violence in response to these debaters, right? The people going out and spreading chick tracts and things like that. You're also getting violence against black people too, that it's reawakening this idea that, like, this very complicated idea. You have black integrationists, you have black nationalists, you have white abolitionists who are integrationists, you have white abolitionists who are not integrationists, you have white people that are pro-slavery, and then just every mix and permutation everywhere in between. And it's just a fairly complicated circumstance. And so this is what ultimately that looks like. Now, on the back end of this, next week, this is where we will finally get to the Civil War. What the hell was it that triggered the Civil War in this regard? Because if all things are hostile and tense, you got William Lloyd Garrison espousing these ideals that the North and the South need to secede. We got to get rid of the Constitution. You have these black nationalists. You have people that are stealing slaves off of the plantation and then making them disappear. At what point do we get to suddenly now the South is seceding from the North? Almost in accordance with what William Lloyd Garrison was saying. Was that a coincidence? Was it on purpose? So that's what we'll be talking about next week. Okay, so we'll finally get to the Civil War and then the events that happen after. But for now, the time being, let's jump into a Q&A. Um, so are there any questions about this? And I am open to the Instagram live chat. If you are on Instagram Live and you want to type a question, you're still welcome to join in on the Zoom and come in and use your voice here. Yeah, Elena.
Hello, thank you so much for the lecture. I have kind of question slash a comment,
Okay.
which is about, as I was saying you guys before, I was watching Atlanta, and there was one episode about about the free, like the towns that were founded by the free people that used to be enslaved, and they would have like very big populations. They would stay in the U.S and that these towns were actually flooded by the government. And there were like at least 5 towns. I couldn't do more research. It wasn't really presented as a story, it was just like something
Yep.
that was mentioned. And I Googled and I saw that towns and the whole communities, like even around Central Park,
Yeah, Central
um,
Park is one of them, actually.
and it was really shocking and devastating to see. But so would people think about leaving as an option just to avoid that, or that would happen later if it's a fair question?
What do you mean when you say leaving, though? Like leaving the country?
Leaving the country, yes.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's about leaving the country. In part, it's fueled by this idea that Black people belong in Africa, right? The other part of it is because there's no safe place for Black people in the Americas, right? So it's just very complicated. In certain cases, you did have Black nationalists that did try to do their best to get as far away, figure out how to develop a town, like a Black town, Black city, Black something, and then inevitably, those hotspots would get targeted by white people who would then go and disrupt, and then disrupting them are like massacring these people. Yeah.
Uh-huh. I actually have a question about that.
Yeah.
It may sound naive. Why would they do that, like with these towns? Why not just leave them alone then?
Yeah,
I
because
don't. I still don't understand in a way. Because if they live by their own like kind of rules, why
yeah.
not just leave them already?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think um although no one can really specifically pinpoint a
Mhm.
singular motive, one could reasonably speculate and say that the idea of Black independence and autonomy is a threat to white supremacy, power, and control. That if
Uh-huh.
Black people have enough freedom and autonomy, they might develop some sense of dignity, get a chip on their shoulder that then makes them think they're better than white people, and who knows, maybe they actually do establish themselves to some extent as better than what white people could potentially offer. But then it's this idea that now you have these Black people that have suddenly risen up above whiteness, and we can't have that in America. I think it's reasonable to speculate that the thinking might be in that way.
So, as far as I understand now, it means that white supremacy is not just the way they used to do it alone, but it's also an active attempt and constant monitoring, like basically, if
Yes,
there is independence that's happening or any sort of freedom. Because, like, if we have like a lot of generations after slavery, you would think in a way that a lot of people would even, like, like even my generation, let's say, some people don't even like they don't understand maybe white supremacy,
yeah,
but you gotta actively work to keep it alive, right? It's an active work, actually. It's not just,
correct.
oh my god, that's crazy. Okay, thanks.
Correct. And then in actively keeping it alive, it's always doing a thing where it kind of just steps on its own toes and undermines its own interests. So,
Mm,
Stephen.
thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to elaborate on
Yeah,
the
please.
the Douglas Adams or Frederick Adams, Douglas Adams, Frederick Adams thing I heard was that he would come across a word in a book or something he was reading, and on the street, if he couldn't read a word, he would dare the kids says, "I bet you can't read that." And when they did, he would learn from that. That's just a
Mm,
story I heard. It was in a history class.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know how he would know that really,
I
unless he
mean,
wrote about it.
but you can never put it by somebody. Maybe they do know how to elicit certain behaviors. So,
Right, but I mean, it's a really good strategy, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
I would add to people. She said they living by their own rules. A lot of people don't live by their own rules. That's just kind of a given. You can find any number of religious groups, any kind of group really, that will not abide by their own rules, whether it be really, Democrat, Republican,
Political, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So that's just kind of a sad fact of life.
yeah.
That's all.
No,
So,
it's just, sorry, just I said it to, it wasn't like in this full sense of a word, like by their own rules, but more or less independent, I meant. More so.
sure, sure. Stephanie.
Hi.
Hey, hey.
So becoming Frederick Douglass, the PBS program, it says that he learned to read through the people he worked for. Um, Mr. and Mrs. Auld were the people that he got sent to Baltimore, and he took care of their child. And oftentimes the children of enslaved people were the same age as the children they took care of.
That's true.
And so what ended up happening was that Mr. Auld taught him how to read, and then he would go to the neighborhood boys who were poorer white children because they were new to having an enslaved person. The Alds didn't know how the rules worked. And so Mrs. Ald would make biscuits, and he would give biscuits to the boys and say, "Hey, I'll give you a biscuit for a word. You tell me a new word." And then also, according to the program, he would read the Columbian Orator and he would read the Bible, and that's how he extended his literacy.
Right on.
Yeah. So,
Um, Thank you so much. You said that's Becoming Frederick Douglass. I haven't seen,
yeah,
I've watched that documentary, but I haven't seen it in years.
yeah, it's pretty old. So,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, yeah, it's
I'll have
called
to
Becoming
I'll have to
Frederick
watch it
Douglass
again.
on Masterpiece PBS. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's free to access.
Yep.
Let's see,
It's on
YouTube.
Amazon. That's the
Oh,
easiest place to get it.
it's
Thank you.
on-
I'll look that up.
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
Masterpiece
Amazon
Theater is always
Prime.
great.
It
Yes,
is.
there you go. All right, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Really quick before we get to Elena, I want to address Rodrigo's question. He says, where does this idea of citizenship and this is our land come from? Uh, the idea of citizenship and this is our land comes from colonization, believe it or not. Um, we kind of covered this extensively on the lectures in my YouTube, especially early on. I want to say one of the first, maybe not if the first lecture that we cover in this period is the circumstances that lead up to colonization. And essentially the idea was in effort to claim ownership of the land, you then have to define who's a member or who belongs on that land and who doesn't. And so then naturally what comes from that is this is ours, mine, that kind of thing. He asks, do different cultures develop different ideas of community and relationships with one another? Um, do you mean like anthropologically? Do you mean in the context of US history? He says, growing up as one of the only brown kids in school, I somewhat felt like everyone else beside on being from here. Do the concepts of nationalism and racism play into these concepts? Are you able to chime in here, and explain a little bit of what you're asking?
Yeah, sorry about that. I
No,
was
it's
tapping
okay.
away on my phone. Yeah, I guess this idea of just like exclusion, despite like finding ways to exclude other people based
Hmm.
on like the color of their skin or their nationality, that kind of idea just kind of builds of, oh, this is what America is. And if you don't fit within this box or this bubble, you're considered an outsider, or you don't belong here, or you should get out of here because of those reasons. I was thinking like based on now I remember from the first section we talked about like establishing this kind of only these are the only people that are allowed to be here, and if you don't like fit in this box, then you shouldn't be here. I guess like coming from indigenous cultures and stuff like that, the idea of like brotherhood, family, and stuff can be a ritual in the sense that these people can be adopted into this family as long as like they follow this thing and they get processed like, oh, we're one big like, happy family. I don't know. Maybe I'm just like misremembering certain things, but that's the idea I'm trying to tackle.
I kind of understood what you were saying, but your mic is
So bad.
I don't it's like staticky.
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't really understand it either.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering if it was on my end. Um I'm not sure what to suggest, but if there's a way you can clean up the audio on your mic,
Is this better?
yes.
I'm so sorry.
Much
I've been
better. It
struggling
was,
with my
yeah, that's
headset.
way better.
Yeah. I guess the idea I'm just trying to tackle is like the idea of separating people based on like their country of origin and their race and stuff like that. Since now I remember that you've talked about the first lecture due to like establishing, oh, this is our colony. What's and if these people don't fit within this box, you need to get out. I don't know. I guess like that's always been like a weird idea to
Oh,
me, mainly because like we're all human beings. We all contribute to this community. Why am I not allowed to be here?
I
Or
see.
yeah.
I see.
If if
So
I yeah.
yeah, part of that is anthropological. Um, Human beings are highly social, and because we're highly social, socializing then means that to some extent you're going to draw a line between who belongs in your group and who doesn't, right? And so then how are you going to delineate who belongs and who doesn't? Part of that is going to be based on, well, really, what do you share in common? And what you share in common can be anything from religion, language, uh, a collective set of political beliefs. It could be place of origin, or like where you're from, right? Geography. There's many different ways to kind of distinguish who belongs and who doesn't. So different people will have different ways of enforcing that boundary of belonging. And one of those things is going to be like race. Now, the reality is that race is the easiest because it's like the most readily visible. Whenever you look at a human being, doesn't matter what human being it is, one of the first things you will pay attention to is what they look like. And what's implicit or inseparable from what they look like is this thing we call race. So naturally, and I say naturally not as a way to justify it, but just a natural consequence of this phenomenon will then be identifying and distinguishing people and then saying you don't belong because you're not like me, get out, you don't need to be here, and blah blah blah. And just it's a way in which we can make ourselves feel better by putting others down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that would make sense. Does I guess the development of the United States being like 300 years old, is it because I was thinking about like Europe, they're very more specific is like, oh, certain facial features, certain characteristics are separates them even more. It's like, oh, you're from the Baltic because like you have such and such. And how in the US and the Americas it's just like, oh, you're just white, you're just black, you're that's where we draw the line kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, yes. And but part of the reason why we draw it that way is because in for lack of a better term, the construction of this country, one of the immediate ways that we were able to consolidate power to who we wanted and deny power to who we wanted was based on skin color. And so then that took place as a kind of cultural precedent that then sets the stage for everything we do now 250 years later.
Okay, sweet. Thank you.
Yep. Elena, you have your hand up, but then you also commented, you said people from some cultures seem more eagerly accepting of cultures. Sure, it's complicated, but it feels like gatekeeping is especially strong in the US. Yeah, I would go so far as to say perhaps I haven't necessarily been exposed to something like that. But it's hard for me to say because the word culture is very loose and fluid. Um, let's see. I've been to Mexico a few times. I've been to Costa Rica a few times. I lived in Japan. Uh, Somewhere in the middle of that, I've always met people who were open to cultural difference. But then if you want to say like collectively, like in Japan, they're very like conformist, right? And then so the foreigner politics is really unique there. And then other places in Spanish speaking parts of America, um, while I wouldn't necessarily say have a sort of animosity to different or distinct cultures, being an American certainly might give me a unique experience that perhaps someone of a different flavor might not have. So it's hard for me to say that there are different places that are open to it. I don't have that experience, but yeah.
Mm. But maybe, have you ever come across if you try and speak the other language, for example, that's not English?
Yeah.
Well, you never spoke English as a second language, so it's hard for
Yeah.
probably it'd be hard for you to tell. But people would be really excited about it
Yep.
and be very accepting.
Yep.
Whereas if you speak English here, it's gonna be always like some sort of like suspicion around it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like,
I would say part of that dynamic is because English is considered the common tongue, right? And so as the common tongue, if you have an accent that isn't the British accent or the Australian one, then there or the American one, then there's going to be some sort of like, wait a minute, who are you? Kind of suspicion. Um, but yeah, I've certainly been in the Spanish speaking context, with my broken Spanish. People are excited to talk to me, and certainly in Japanese too. I've had that happen. So yeah, you're right. I don't know.
Actually, my question was about something else. So you keep saying that nothing's new under the sun, right? And that a
Yeah,
lot of things they keep happening.
yeah.
Do you think you could predict what's gonna happen? So,
Um,
Seriously.
yeah, sure. I don't think one could ever confidently predict. I can't say on September 21st, 2016 at 6 p.m., Jesus is gonna come back, and you hear that thing every 10 years or so. But I don't think I could predict, right? But I do think that if you're looking through the eye of history, one could certainly calculate likelihood, right? And I use that language intentionally, right? The prediction markets, which are, yeah, right. The newest date for the rapture is Easter, by the way. Right, right. So it's a thing where it's like, I wouldn't necessarily say prediction. At least in my mind, prediction comes with a level of like confidence that
Mm,
like this has happened, and this has happened. Therefore, this will happen, right? There's a level of confidence. Whereas for me, I think it's more like you can certainly predict things, but based on likelihood, right?
mhm,
So instead of it being pure confidence, it's going, I can look through the eye of history and I can see that certain patterns are repeating. And given that these patterns have happened in this context, perhaps I can then characterize, quantify the likelihood for these other things to happen. But then, in my opinion, there's always got to be a grain of salt. And the grain of salt is going to be the time that we're living in right now is not the time that we're looking through the eye of history, right? Back in the 1860s, they didn't have nuclear weapons, right? There
mhm.
weren't AR-15s, there weren't tanks and grenades and rocket launchers and all the sophisticated high-tech shit we have today that would then lead to something like a civil war. Now, while I'm not saying another civil war can't happen, I am saying that it's in a different context.
Mhm.
Americans are fatter, less likely to exercise and work out. We have more sophisticated warfare related technologies and strategies. There's all these AI computers now. We have nuclear weapons, right? So the world might be a little bit slower
Mm.
to just behave exactly the way they did in the 1800s. And that's where you have to take anything predictive in this context with a grain of salt, is because at the end of the day, you don't really know. Does that make sense?
Yes, so it basically means that the ethical dynamic is more so the same, but now we have more fear-mongering factors like the nuclear weapon, the fear of cancellation, I don't know. And
Social
that's it.
media, right?
And
We've got,
yeah, and
yeah,
AI. And that's it. And but
AI,
everything else is still the same in a way.
algorithms, but then in an interesting way, although we have in the context of the US, we've always had corrupt politicians and especially a corrupt president, right? Um, Donald Trump is not the first, right? So it just becomes a thing where like it's just the circumstances are different. Like it's hard. And then Steven says, and even a 99% confidence interval isn't total. Yeah, sure, it's just really, really likely, but like you've always got to take these things with a grain of salt. So I think in one sense, I would say it's always useful, beneficial, reliable to see things through the eye of history, but never convince yourself that you know the future, right?
Mhm.
Um, because we don't until it actually happens. What can we really do with that? So, um, yeah, I think there are some eerie patterns, like not only when you go through like pre-Civil War history, but when you go through like the history of World War I, the history of World War II. the history of Vietnam. There are some eerie things that like they do tend to repeat. But then the outcome of a lot of these things is always different and distinct. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got to, it's always useful to see through the eye of history, but then uh yeah, just be humble. I don't know.
But the racial history keeps being unresolved because we've never seen the resolution ever, in a
Yeah,
way.
sure. Oops. Um, yeah, I would say that's something we've never seen, and I am one of those firm believers that it can manifest in reality. That's something we certainly have to keep pushing for, but it requires sustainable approaches, and those sustainable approaches, in my opinion, will be scientifically informed. That they will be. I don't know. I just think putting our best minds together, we can cultivate the world we truly want to see, but it just requires calculation, strategy, and cunning.
And the last question, is it about dismantling the white supremacy as a context?
Mm. Yeah, for me personally, of course, I always have an interest in dismantling white supremacy. But on that same note, I think I'm just interested in dismantling racial supremacy in general, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that believe it or not, I do want to see a world where there is like equal opportunity, fair pay, peace. People do have the time and space to be leisurely. There isn't always infighting, and animosity. I do want to see that world, right? And to some extent, I guess you could call me crazy. You could say it's naive or whatever, but I do think that I'm on the optimistic end of we can get there. Um, but
No,
it
it's
does,
very inspiring.
yeah, but I don't think I don't know. I can recognize that it's really hard. So
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for answering.
yeah, yeah. Steven says, like when Russia started bringing blood to the front lines for the Ukraine invasion, you don't bring blood to the front lines unless you're going to be engaged in battle. But still, we didn't know it would happen until they invaded. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, sure, sure. Um, are there any other questions? Any questions on the IG chat? Maybe you're not able to join in on Zoom, but you have a question you want to type. I can see people popping in and popping out. And I'm happy to entertain your questions, but things are slowing down here. Um, Yeah. So, I mean, if they're slowing down, I'm not going to waste your time. I guess we can kind of wrap up here, I suppose. But like I said, in the next chapter, I will do my best to make sure that I give you plenty of time to have access to the scans. I haven't been able to upload as early as I would like to because of the changes around baby and things like that. Um, but I will make sure that you have access to chapter 10 and what we'll be covering next week will be the events that directly led up to, thank you, directly led up to the Civil War. Why did it happen? We all know it happened. We know the outcome. We have a loose understanding of why it happened the way that it did. Um, but because we're diving into all of this history here, I am going to point out to you what specifically led to it. And when we talk about that, that should eliminate the whole states' rights argument, right? It should eliminate a lot of the common and unnecessary misunderstandings, but it should also illuminate to you just how integral white supremacy, racism, anti-black ideas are into the United States that it would then lead to the secession of multiple states. So we'll be talking about that next week, and I guess we'll leave it there. Enjoy your extra 30 minutes on this fine Sunday, and I will see you all next week. All right, people. Thanks. Take care.